right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's Transplant Focus webinar on overcoming survivor's guilt. Over the course of today's program, we'll discuss a common experience for many post-transplant recipients and explore strategies to help these patients overcome their guilt and recognize the positive impact of the donation that led to their life-saving transplant. My name is Deanna Fenton, Senior Manager of Educational Program Development and Operations here at the Alliance, and it's my pleasure to be here to kick off the discussion. Now, before we begin, I'd like to encourage everyone to take advantage of the chat and Q&A features that are available to you. Should you be interested in engaging with your colleagues and panelists, we recommend submitting any comments that you may have through the chat box. Likewise, should you have any direct questions for our panel, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature. If you happen to be new to the Zoom platform, please take some time to locate both features in the navigation bar at the bottom of your Zoom window. Additionally, for anyone joining us today as a group, we'd like to ask that you take this opportunity to complete the following poll to share approximately how many people have joined your group. Your responses will ultimately help us and our panel assess the level of engagement in today's session. Now, for anyone who may be interested in our upcoming programs, please note that registration is currently open for a very interesting and innovative presentation on the recent xenotransplant breakthrough. If you're interested in learning more about the latest surrounding this groundbreaking research, I would highly encourage you to register to join us for this program next week on February 1st at 2 p.m. Eastern. Shortly thereafter, we'll kick off with our next donation focus webinar, which will focus on engaging our hospital partners to lead policy change and ensure successful donation outcomes. Be sure to join us for that discussion on February 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Now, as always, you can find out more about all of our upcoming programs on our website at organdonationalliance.org. Lastly, for anyone that's interested in continuing education credits, please note that there'll be one nursing contact hour and one Category 1 CEP-C credit offered as a result of your participation today. To claim your credits, you'll be asked to complete a brief online evaluation to provide us with your valuable feedback regarding today's presentation. Details on how to access the evaluations and claim your credits will be provided via email following the conclusion of today's session. Now, if you happen to be listening in a group, please be sure to get the evaluation email from your group lead. As a friendly reminder, you'll have 30 calendar days to complete your evaluations and claim your certificates. Now, with that, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome our moderators. Today, we are joined by Talia Giordano, Director of Family Services and the Caregiver Lifeline Program at Gift of Life Family House. Co-moderating with her is Sarah Morin, Clinical Social Worker at Maine Medical Center. Ladies, I want to thank you so much for being with us today, and more importantly, for your efforts in coordinating today's program. At this point, I'll go ahead and turn the floor over to you to go ahead and get us started.
Great. Hi, my name is Sarah Morin, and I'm the Transplant Social Worker at the Maine Transplant Program. I'm really excited to co-moderate this with Talia today. And I'd like to thank the Alliance for coordinating these learning opportunities. And it goes without saying that these kind of professional opportunities are so important and valuable to our everyday practice. So I really appreciate when they arise, and it's really exciting to be part of it. So our webinar today is entitled Overcoming Survivor's Guilt, Strategies to Help Recipients Understand the Positive Impact of Donation. Personally, I know that guiding a patient through survivor's guilt isn't easy. Every patient is different, and meeting them where they're at is essential. Validating thoughts and concerns and empathizing with those complicated feelings to guide them down the path sometimes can go smoothly and sometimes not. So it is our hope today that you will learn, one, to identify two contemporary grief theories related to donor family grief, two, define a recipient's survivor's guilt and how that impacts the physical and emotional health of recipients. Three, learn some techniques to support the recipients. And four, hear anecdotal donor family experiences that can be shared with recipients and therefore provide support. And I love being able to share those stories with people that I hear. It really makes a difference. So now I'll turn it over to Talia to introduce our speaker.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Like Sarah, I work with transplant patients and caregivers, and this is such an important topic since we know what families experience after a transplant related to survivor's guilt. And I'm really excited to introduce Lara as she is my colleague at the Gift of Life, and I've known her now for 11 years and she's been such an amazing resource as it relates to survivor's guilt and working with our transplant patients and families through this. Lara is a licensed social worker and certified you're gonna have to say that, Lara. She's presented to transplant centers, schools, and various professional groups about donation and transplantation in her role as the Director of Family Support Services at the Gift of Life Donor Program in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Lara's been with Gift of Life since 2003, so she has many years experience on this topic. She's presented at NACO, TRIO, which is Transplant Recipients International Organization, the Association of Organ Procurement Organizations, the Transplant Games of America, Society for Transplant Social Workers, UNOS, and the Gift of Life Institute. Approximately 5 times a year, she also leads a didactic on communicating with grieving families to all new staff at our OPO, the Gift of Life Donor Program. Lara obtained her BS in Education and Social Policy from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, and her MS in Social Work from Columbia University in New York. So it's a pleasure to introduce you to Lara today, and thank you so much for being here.
Hi, everybody. So the CT after my name stands for Certified Thanatologist.
So sorry.
Yeah, sorry, it's a tongue twister. Thanatology is the study of death, dying, and bereavement. That was some advanced learning that I started after working at Gift of Life. Welcome. I think I'm controlling the slides. Maybe? Yes. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Before we get into it, I would like to get a sense of who is here in my audience. So Deanna is going to put up a poll with quite a list of different job descriptions. And if you could choose the job that most closely aligns with what you do, that would be helpful for me to see kind of who we're speaking with. So Deanna, can you put that poll up for everybody? Oh, there it is. Great. There's a lot there. If it's, we tried to come up with everything. If we did not cover you, I apologize. You can just select other. So just take a second and let us know kind of what you do every day, and that'll be helpful. And we'll keep it up for just a few more seconds. I guess, Deanna, you can let us know when we have a good good response rate. Okay, so we have about 16% are transplant nurses. We have about 20% social workers, 23% transplant coordinators, and then about 23% of OPO support, family support aftercare, and some other folks in there. So great, thank you so much for letting me know who's joining today. All right, so let's get started. Sarah went over the learning objectives, and sorry, I'm having trouble advancing the slides. There we go. There is a lot of words on this slide, but really the objectives today are to provide you with an understanding of survivor's guilt and how to best support recipients who might experience that. We can support them with learning different techniques, but also having a better understanding of the donor family experience. As you will see, one of the best ways for recipients to feel better about their guilt is to hear from a donor family, even one that is not their donor family. And when that isn't always possible, transplant professionals can share anecdotal donor family experiences and provide that perspective for them. So we are going to, oops, I'm sorry. Having some technical difficulties. The agenda on the previous slide, we're gonna talk about the intersection of grief and donation, review the concept of survivor's guilt and what it may look like, and how the challenges that recipients face may add to their survivor guilt experience and how we can best support them. And then I do hope we will have time at the end for some questions and some good discussion. So when the OPO works with a potential donor family, it is important to always remember that they are first and foremost a family in crisis and a family in acute grief. We cannot let their grief take a backseat to the donation process. Their grief doesn't magically disappear just because the opportunity of donation has been broached. And this is important and considered in the timing of the donation conversation. A family must have the opportunity to have their many questions answered about the medical course and care before they can be in the right headspace to consider a donation conversation. And making sure that the family's basic needs are met so that they can be present for the complicated and challenging discussion about the next steps, including donation. Our coordinators strive to provide compassionate care throughout the entire donation process. Even before we are introduced to the family, we want to be sure that they've had access to their loved one, have had the opportunity to ask questions about testing, especially brain death testing, and are given the privacy to grieve. Working with the family during the donation process is not just donor management and organ allocation, it is providing compassionate care and support for the family, however they may look for them. And that care continues in our aftercare departments, which are made up of master's level social workers and counselors who specialize in grief and bereavement. Many of us, even though we work in fields where there is loss and grief, and even those of you on the transplant side, you may not think you work in a field with loss and grief, but there are still losses experienced by your transplant families. There is, of course, the loss related to a patient's death, but there are many non-death losses that recipients or waiting list patients and their families experience. So while we deal with loss and grief often, most of us have not had any formal education about grief theory. Even I only had one course in my master's program, and it was an elective. So I want to share with you a quick review of some theories that I think will provide context for the donor family experience. This theory here, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, is well known. She came out with this theory in 1969. And while most people are familiar with the theory, they are not familiar with how she came up with it. Kubler-Ross studied individuals who had terminal illnesses, and she documented how they grieved their own pending deaths. Her theory has since been applied to individuals grieving the death of another. I share it here because even if you haven't heard her name, you've probably heard of these terms for her stages. Her theory was groundbreaking and really got people talking about grief in a way that had not been before. But I find that this theory isn't as useful in describing the experience of grieving individuals. And there are other more contemporary theories that I prefer, and I'll review those shortly. But it is important to be aware of Kubler-Ross's stages because you will hear people use these terms to describe what they or someone else is experiencing. Instead, I'd like to share with you this model by William Worden. It's a much more proactive model than Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages. Even the wording is more proactive, tasks versus stages. Stages imply passively going through something. Worden instead says that the mourner must accomplish certain tasks in order to integrate the loss. His first task, accept the reality of the loss. This is a very cognitive stage, but it also has many emotional levels. When someone dies, there is a sense that it didn't really happen. This first task is to acknowledge that the person is dead, they are gone, and they will not return. Families faced with a decision about donation have to accept the death somewhat, or they would not be able to engage in a conversation with our coordinators. However, especially when it's a sudden or unexpected death, acknowledging the full reality of the loss may occur over months or even years. During this stage, there might be a retaining of possessions, leaving everything ready for the person to return. So clothing is still hanging in the closet, the room is kept exactly as it was. Or there might be a denial of the meaning of the loss. He wasn't a good father. We weren't that close. Belief and disbelief are intermittent. You might hear something on the radio and think, oh, I need to tell Bill about this, and then realizing you can't. I once had a donor mother tell me that for the first 5 or 6 months, she said, the space between my head and my heart was very far apart. And I think that's a beautiful way of describing kind of this discrepancy between what people know and what they feel. She understood that her son had died, but her heart didn't want to accept it. Funeral rituals that are so important can really help people with this task. The second task is to experience the pain of the grief. It is necessary to acknowledge and work through the pain, or it will come up in other ways, with psychosomatic symptoms, with drug or alcohol use. This can be difficult with society's message that we should move on and not be outward with our grief reactions in certain situations or after a certain period of time. And it's often easier to avoid, repress, or deny the pain of grief than it is to confront it. Having a good social support system can help with this task. His third task, adjust to a new environment without the individual who had died. This often occurs 3 to 4 months after the death. It can take a considerable amount of time to realize what it is like to live without the person who died. This is going to mean different things for different people depending on what the relationship was with the deceased and the various roles that the deceased played. You have to identify all the roles that he or she played in the family. It's also having to redefine who you are in relation to that person. If your child dies, are you still a parent? The English language doesn't even have a word to describe this scenario. If our spouse dies, we can be called a widow. If our parents die, we can be called an orphan. There is no word to describe someone whose child has died. The bereaved must develop a new identity. Some of this can be positive as they discover positive aspects of their changed identity. Maybe they're more assertive or more sensitive. The concept of post-traumatic growth is an exciting new area with grief and loss, recognizing that there is room for positive changes as a result of experiencing something traumatic. There also are secondary losses to each primary loss. The mourner has to recognize these secondary losses and cope with them while they also cope with the primary loss. There is also a need to adjust one's sense of the world. A death can cause us to challenge the way we look at ourselves, our lives, and our faith. Worden's fourth task, to find an enduring connection, does not mean moving on and forgetting. It means moving on with life and returning to a normal level of function with finding a suitable place for this person in their mind, hearts, and lives. We don't have to relinquish our connection to the person who died. Rather, we have to restructure and revise that relationship. This is when people can remember their loved one and smile and laugh and at memories and not only cry. They still may cry, but it won't be their only reaction. And these memories are an integral part of mourning. Sometimes people are told to take down all the photos or remove objects belonging to the person who has died. But remembering and embracing the past makes moving toward the future possible. Worden stresses that this is not a linear model. You don't need to complete the first task before moving to the second, and you can be working on these tasks simultaneously, moving back and forth between them. When I've had the opportunity to talk about this model with donor families, they find relief in knowing that there is this way to conceptualize what they are experiencing. Kubler-Ross's stages don't fit exactly, and they feel like they're doing something wrong. Another way of thinking about grief is meaning reconstruction. According to Niemeyer, meaning reconstruction in response to a loss is the central process of grieving. And donation can help provide meaning to our families. So often our families ask, why did this happen? And while donation doesn't take away the pain or their grief, it can be a point of solace for them as they try to make meaning of this unexpected death. One example I can share is of a donor family sitting in the hospital after the discussion of end-of-life decision-making and saying yes to donation. This father said to his wife, "This will be where we find joy. Not now, but someday. This will be where we find some joy from what happened." He was making meaning of what happened to their child. Not every family recognizes this right away, but many of them get there over time. Another contemporary theory is one of continuing bonds. Like Worden's fourth task, it is not about moving on and forgetting. Instead, it's actually healthy and necessary to find some way to stay connected to the deceased person. And donation can be one of those continuing bonds. There are recipients out there living because of their loved one. We give families new titles. We call them donor mom or donor husband. We create communities of other donor families with support groups or at larger events like our Donor Dash or at the transplant games. We encourage them to join their OPO as ambassadors and to tell their story. This is especially powerful because when someone dies, people tend to stop speaking about them or saying their name because they are worried about upsetting the person. But telling stories, saying their name can be a really meaningful experience for grieving individuals, and we encourage that. As an example, we have a donor father. His name is Tom. Tom's son Curtis was a teen riding his bike and he was hit by a car. And he became a donor, and this was over 30 years ago. Tom is one of our most active volunteers. He especially loves speaking in area high schools to students in driver's ed or in health classes to talk to them about donation and to encourage them to put it on their license when they get their license for the first time. And Tom has said, for every class that he speaks to, that's 20 more people who know his son Curtis. And, I would never say that Tom is stuck in his grief or he's not functioning well or there's anything wrong with the fact that he's still talking about Curtis 30 years later. He has found a really beautiful way of staying connected to his son through telling his story of donation. And so, of course, there's a unique bond between donor families and recipients. And I think what's key to think about here is that organ donation benefits not just the recipient, but also the donor family. Donation is an extraordinary act of altruism at a time of intense tragedy. And when we empower donor families and honor their loved one's gift, the healing power of donation is maximized. Families feel empowered by making a decision when so much else is out of their control. Whether it's making the decision to donate or fulfilling their loved one's decision, that can have a huge impact on feeling less powerless. And for those families whose loved one's death might be stigmatized, maybe they died because of violence or suicide or drug overdose, there is a feeling that their death is not a fair depiction of how they lived their life. And if there is fear or shame in the cause of death, donation can provide a different narrative for these families. And regardless of the cause of death, the last chapter isn't that they died, it's that they saved someone else's life. And as I mentioned in the continuing bonds, this legacy established by donation has a positive impact on families as well. I can share an excerpt from a donor family letter whose family member was an organ and tissue donor. They wrote, "My goodness, I didn't realize that the donations could be used in so many different procedures. He really did keep on helping others. That he could be a blessing in this way to others to help try and alleviate their pain and suffering makes me feel that we as a family gave not just the recipients, but ourselves a gift as well." Okay, well, with that foundation, let's move on to the topic at hand, survivor's guilt. I'd like to poll the group now. Who here has had a patient express survivor's guilt? So Deanna's going to put up the poll. Who here has had a patient express survivor's guilt, either using those words or maybe using other words that you might define as that? So yes, no, or not sure. Give it a few seconds. Okay, Deanna, can we see how people responded? So about 90% of the people here have said yes. Okay, it's kind of what I expected. It can be the elephant in the room. It is huge. It can be a burden. It can impact how recipients process what's happened to them and how they incorporate this new organ into themselves. I want to share with you this post that I found on the Donate Life America Facebook page. It was from back in March of 2016. It was a heart recipient who is now waiting for another heart transplant. And I'm not going to read the whole post aloud, but I did pull out 2 lines for you. "I feel guilty every time I remember that I'm waiting for a new hero heart. In the midst of my immense gratitude, I feel guilty. I feel guilty every time I remember that I'm waiting for a new hero heart. And in the midst of my immense gratitude, I feel guilty." Keep these in mind as we discuss the next slide. So survivor's guilt can be defined as a sense of deep guilt that comes when one survives something. Survivor's guilt derives from situations where a person has been involved in a life-threatening event and lived to tell about it. It was first documented and discussed after the Holocaust, and what we have since learned is that survivor's guilt is far more common than was initially understood. Certainly, it's been brought up a lot more since September 11th, I watched a documentary about one of the firehouses in Lower Manhattan this past 9/11, and it was full of survivor guilt. It wasn't called that, but it was there. Survivor guilt explores the other side of the coin of why me, precisely why not me? Why did I survive when others did not? Some people may express feeling undeserving or unworthy. This can vary dramatically for each individual. And survivor's guilt can coexist with other responses, such as relief and gratitude. Just like the Facebook post I just showed, people can feel really conflicted. And I think because we typically think of survivor's guilt as something that occurs after something huge, like the Holocaust or September 11th, or a major catastrophe, people who survive smaller things don't recognize that they can also experience survivor guilt. People like our transplant recipients, for example. So for the transplant recipient, they can absolutely experience survivor's guilt. They might express not feeling worthy of the gift. Are they the right age, gender, religion? Will the donor family approve of them? Am I the kind of person they would have wanted this gift to go to? And then also thinking about themselves compared to their patient friends. Why did I get this gift, but Julie from support group did not? Seeing friends from the group or the clinic die on the waiting list, patients who are kind and have families who love them. Why were they not the lucky ones? Why am I more deserving than that person? What kind of expectations do they have as far as their recovery? Has their recovery not gone as planned for them or their team? Will that experience lead them to worry that they might be letting the family down? Have I not taken care of this gift well enough? Did I do something that caused my rejection? If they have to stay on dialysis post-transplant, or if there's been graft failure, why do they reject this gift? Will the family be upset to know that the organ is not working the way it should be? And then being worried that they're not being good stewards of the gift. What obligations do they have to the donor family, to the transplant team, to their family, or to themselves with this second chance at life? Again, am I worthy of this gift? I've often heard some recipients say that they try to live their life like their donor is watching. And that's an amazing way to live their life, but that's a lot of pressure as well. I work mostly with donor families, but I do get to interact with recipients who volunteer for our organization. So I decided to reach out to them and see what I could learn from them about survivor's guilt. I sent out an email to volunteers and asked them the following questions. Waiting for what organ did you receive? What, if any, thoughts did you have about your deceased donor when you learned you would be needing a life-saving transplant? And can you share some of your feelings, what they were after receiving that gift of life? Based on how they responded, I sent them a second set of questions. Is there anything that would have been helpful for you to have learned before or after your transplant in coping with your feelings of guilt? And what, if anything, has helped you come to terms with the guilt that you felt? And here are some of the responses I received to the first set of questions. Again, the first question was, what, if any thoughts did you have about your deceased donor when you learned you would need a life-saving transplant? And they shared, it was something I struggled with for a long time and prevented me from getting on the waiting list. I didn't want someone to die so I could live. I prayed to God that he would take me instead so my donor could keep living. And I was not sure if I personally wanted to just die or if someone else should die so I could live. I never had so many mixed emotions in my life. And the next question we asked was, can you share some of the feelings you had after receiving the gift of life? And they shared, I was grateful and happy, but I felt a lot of sorrow for the family that lost their loved one. I really didn't know how to feel, and I felt guilty being happy. I felt thankful to be alive, but guilty because I got to live and my donor didn't. I also felt an overwhelming desire to give back as a way of showing my thanks and gratitude. And so for those who answered the first batch of questions with an answer that either named guilt or I interpreted as guilt, I sent them 2 more questions. As a reminder, that first question was, is there anything that would have been helpful for you to have learned before or after your transplant in coping with your feelings of guilt? Now, this person shared, I think what have been helpful is a better understanding of the process and more understanding of how difficult this was for me from the social worker I worked with. I never talked to my team about how I felt, that I spent many days and nights talking to my husband. Look at that. She never talked to her team about it. She had support and resources there, and she didn't take advantage of it. That makes me sad for her. And thirdly, I don't even remember if the subject of guilt was addressed. I'm not saying it wasn't, only that I don't remember. We certainly know that what we share with patients and families is not always what they recall being said, so it doesn't surprise me that this recipient has no memory of this being discussed. But I also think that transplant teams are in the business of saving lives and making everything better. So there can be an unconscious avoidance of anything negative or difficult, like not getting a transplant in time, or having a difficult recovery, or the many mixed emotions that come with getting that transplant. And there isn't always the time and space allowed to really have these difficult emotional discussions. And depending on how sick the patient is, you might be having most of your discussions with the caregiver, not the patient anyway. Our second follow-up question was, what, if anything, has helped you come to terms with the guilt you feel or felt? So this person said, meeting with donor families truly changed my perception. Hearing the stories and getting to know their experiences would help other transplant patients. Prayer, meeting donor families and hearing their stories always helps. And volunteering with the OPO has been very helpful. Both recipients and donor families work together, and my interaction with them has helped me deal with any feelings of guilt. I should say that having the ability to meet a real live donor family, even one that's not your own, can be incredibly powerful. My team and I meet often with the pre and post-transplant support groups in our region, and we try when we can to bring a donor family with us so that patients can hear from him or her and get a better insight into their experience. I strongly encourage those of you on the transplant side to reach out to your OPO and take advantage of my colleagues as speakers for your groups and to ask for a donor family to come along. If you don't know who your OPO representative is, please reach out after the presentation and I'm happy to give you the name of somebody in your area. So instead of telling recipients to stop feeling guilty, instead, what we're going to tell them is the following: to accept what they're feeling. Guilt can be an incredibly stigmatized emotion. Letting them know that it is a natural feeling and that it needs to be acknowledged and processed. They're not alone. This is more common than they may realize. A support group to connect with others who have felt this way can be reassuring and helpful. Celebrating your own survival does not in any way show disrespect for the donor or mean that you can't also grieve for that donor and his or her family. And so they should do that. They should grieve. They can still take space to mourn the donor even though you don't know them. Have a prayer said at church. Plant a tree in their unnamed memory. Send a condolence card to the family. These are rituals that will help the recipient mourn. What can they do with that guilt? They can use it to help others. They can educate others who have just gotten their transplant, or even those who are waiting. We all can fixate on the whys. Difficult as it may be, trying to let go of asking why and focus on the meaning that they can create from their second chance at life. Volunteer at the hospital, volunteer with the local OPO, or find an organization that is near and dear to them. Get involved in the donation and transplantation community in some way. And embracing life may sound cheesy, but it is important to stress that even in spite of the guilt, that it's important to enjoy the life you've been given. Donor families want recipients to live. That's why they gave the gifts. So it can be helpful to reframe some common thoughts and comments. So this is a very common sentiment. Somebody died in order for me to live. I imagine many of you on the transplant side have heard this said to you. So a response when someone says this to you: no one died because of you. This feeling is a natural response to knowing that your gift came because someone died. But donor families separate the two situations. Their loved one died, period, end of sentence. Their loved one was a donor. Two totally separate things. I don't want to be a disappointment to them. The response? What you're feeling is very common, and many recipients wonder if they're worthy of this gift. Donor families have few expectations of recipients. They want them to live their life and to be grateful for the second chance in whatever way possible. What am I supposed to do now with the second chance? Be the best steward of this gift that you can. And that can look like taking care of yourself in this gift. It can be doing things that you couldn't do before, paying it forward and being the voice for those who are still on the waiting list, finding joy, whatever that means for you, and living your life. And this comes up a lot while people are waiting. I don't feel comfortable praying for someone to die, right? What am I supposed to do? Pray for someone to die? And the response is no. You pray for someone to say yes. People are going to die every day. What we are hoping for and praying for is that someone will say yes when offered the opportunity for donation. I actually got this from a liver recipient. It's what he told his friends when they felt awkward praying while he was waiting for his transplant. And I think it's a beautiful way of reframing exactly what we're doing here. We're not praying for someone to die. We're praying for someone to say yes. And so I share that all the time. So thank you, Brock, for sharing that with me. And what donor families say to us? I think what most recipients don't understand is that most donor families understand that their loved one's death and subsequent decision to donate are completely separate. And many donor families are surprised to learn that they too are given a gift by their loved one's donation after death. They want the recipients to live, to be with their families, to take this second chance and enjoy it. They wanted to prevent another family from having to say goodbye to someone they love. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a new ending to their loved one's story. Instead of their story ending with their death, the last chapter is about how they saved lives. And as we heard recipients share their thoughts on survivor's guilt, I wanted to leave you with the thoughts of a donor mother herself. I think this clip will give you something meaningful. A few years ago, Robin Young from NPR's Here and Now interviewed a donor family from Philadelphia. It was part of a larger segment about the increase in heroin overdoses in this country and the impact it had had on donor programs. Most, if not all, OPOs had seen a huge increase in the number of organ donors due to overdose over the last few years. Charles Grugan Jr. is one of those donors. He's the young man standing in the picture between his two sisters. Charles's family has talked openly about his addiction and his struggle. This clip is from the end of the segment. Robin asks Eileen, Charles's mother, about the recipients. Listen carefully to what Eileen says it has meant to her and her family. Okay. Oh. I'm sorry. Trying to get back to Deanna. It's not letting me click on it. Can you do that? Oh, here it is.
So
Sorry.
strikes me that
Try that again.
you have given this incredible gift to these three men, but they're giving a gift to you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, they are. Absolutely. I said it was that day in the hospital. I said, it's sad it is. It's a
Whoops, it paused. Let's try that again. I'm sorry, everybody. Deanna, can you try that again?
win for both people today. It's a win that Charles was able to give his gift. It's also a win that those families are being able to get a second chance and do great things.
Thank you. That's Eileen Grugan. Her son Charles died of an opioid overdose in 2011, and his organs have saved 3 men. Alexandra Glaze.
Sorry about that, audio technical. But I hope you were able to get that, that she really felt that there was a win on both sides. Her family was able to celebrate his legacy. You see here a picture of his team. This is our donor dash. This is Charles's legacy, the team that comes together every year to remember him and celebrate his life and raise funds for the gift of life. And of course, the 3 men who received his organs. It was a win for them. And so it really was a positive experience for their family. So now I'd like to open it up to any kind of questions or discussion about your experiences with with recipients who are experiencing survivor guilt. Happy to, if there's any questions in the chat or anything
Thanks.
Talia or Sarah has seen. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lara. That was really amazing. And I think it was super helpful to hear some of those quotes from families, recipients, donor families, and then from Charles's mother. So a few questions came up for me, and actually I am interested if people don't actually have questions, but have had experiences with recipients and survivors' guilt, like how they've handled it, or what they did to support their families. If you want to share that in the chat, that would be really great. One thing that has come up a lot with the families that I work with is usually they're very recently transplanted, so they're still dealing with all of the emotions of like this new life and just physically adjusting to everything. They express the guilt and the grief for the donor that they don't know. So we try to talk to them a bit about, when they're ready, potentially writing their donor family. And I know you didn't talk about that, but we've always shared, if you're feeling this way, could be helpful to share your condolences and sympathy with the donor family, as well as expressing your gratitude for this gift that you received. So do you have any comments on that, or what would be good advice for, around that for families who may be interested in writing or are experiencing guilt?
Yeah, I think writing, we all as social workers certainly know that writing is a really powerful tool for from therapeutic value. So I think when a recipient or a family, if the recipient's not ready, the family to take pen to paper or type to be able to put their thoughts down is a really important process to kind of absorbing the magnitude of the gift. So I think it's beneficial for them. And then, a lot of donor families would love to hear from the recipients. And I know that recipients often are concerned that writing may upset the family, or it may upset them and remind them. And, a letter isn't going to remind them of their loved one's loss. They're thinking of it every day. And so really getting a letter from a recipient is a welcome experience. I know we personally at Gift of Life, when we get a letter from a recipient, when we send it on to a donor family, we do put it in another envelope with a cover letter on top so that they know what they're getting, and they don't have to be surprised opening it up. They can wait and maybe read it when everyone's home, or maybe save it for another day. But writing, I think, is an incredibly important tool as recipients process the gift, and it's really meaningful for donor families to just know a little bit about the person where this gift went, because they really don't know anything about the recipients.
Laura, to follow up on that, because I do encourage myself in my practice, a lot of recipients to write their donor families, but I also spend some time preparing them that if they do take the time to do this, there's no wrong way of doing it, but also they might not hear back.
Yeah.
Like they might hear back, they may not, they could hear back in a year, and just talking about that sort of preparing people for what's normal within that.
Yeah, right. I think everyone, for a lot of people, it's like, oh, I'm going to meet my donor family. And that's very rare. It's not what we see on like People magazine or on like the talk shows. So writing, it should be really, the benefit of writing is meant, I think, they shouldn't expect to get a response. It should be the exercise is really for them to be able to begin to articulate what this gift means. And I know that some people and donor families struggle with this as well. A blank piece of paper can feel very overwhelming. So often I'll tell people to like buy a card, because it's an enclosed space, right? So it doesn't feel as endless as a blank piece of paper or your computer screen. The card has only so much space that they can fill. And I also tell people, you don't have to think of this as being the only letter you're ever going to write. So you don't have to include everything in this one communication. So not to get too overwhelmed at the thought of writing the perfect letter.
So it looks like we have a couple questions coming through. So I'll read one. And one question is, should you address guilt during the entire process of the transplant, during the initial psychosocial assessment, well listed, post-transplant, or only once and then wait when the patient brings it up again?
Well, I think certainly we know that repeating things is usually helpful for people when they're getting a lot of information. So I think just once might not be enough. I don't think you want to tell people how they should feel because they may not feel that. And if they don't, that's okay too. So I think recognizing or letting them recognize that this is a common experience that they may experience, and maybe mentioning it a few times in the pre and then a check-in at the post to kind of check in with them a number of times to see if they're experiencing anything that may sound like that is probably the best way to do it. You want to normalize it. Bringing it up is not going to make them suddenly feel guilty. It's going to normalize what they may be feeling and not know how to articulate what it is.
Yeah, and I think, Lara, to follow up with that, I think it's common for us as professionals to think about survivor's guilt after the transplant. But really, like from one of your quotes, and I just interacted with a person who was on the wait list yesterday who was sharing the feelings of not being worthy of getting a transplant. So I think there is, in some patients and caregivers, even that feeling of like, why should I get it? Which starts way before the transplant even happens.
For sure. Yeah.
So another question came up. Can you speak to recipients who are fearful of writing or meeting their donor family because of the guilt?
I would just encourage them to articulate their gratitude the best way, and to open up that communication and be open to whatever kind of response the donor family may have. I mean, this is an opportunity to learn more about that person, learn more about the family that made that decision or carried out that person's decision. And, they don't have to write this huge, long, emotional letter. It could just be, thank you so much. My condolences on your loss. And that's it. And, that's what they are able to articulate in that moment, then that's what they can do. And again, there are amazing cards out there. There are some cards that I swear you think might be written for this exact situation. So I would encourage them to, spend some time in the card aisle. Maybe they'll find something that captures how they're feeling.
There's a question wondering, are there any pamphlets available that address survivors' experiences to share with recipients?
I don't have a pamphlet.
I have a resource.
Actually, Talia, because I don't.
Yeah, it just reminded me of we've done webinars for patients and families, specifically for recipients and candidates and families. And Lara's team has done 2 that are on our website, one talking about survivor's guilt and one talking about writing to the donor family. And both of them cover the recipient experience. And they're meant to be for transplant patients and their families. So that they can kind of feel connected and understand what that's like. And I think one of them even has a recipient who also talks about their experience with survivor's guilt. That's the only resources that I'm available that are webinars or virtual as opposed to something written.
Awesome. I have a question about working with the team, because I feel like when you brought this up, I was like, oh, we're so bad at doing this, is the medical team bringing up the fact that it's okay to feel guilty or even discussing it. I don't think our doctors and our nurses and anyone, it's like the elephant in the room and nobody addresses it.
Right.
And so I don't know, just any thoughts about working with this team to help make them feel comfortable to address it? Because yet they do this work every day. This is their passion. This is what they love. But to talk about the elephant in the room, they're not going to do it.
Yeah, that's hard. So, I guess if people are on this webinar going back to their team and saying, I sat in on this really interesting webinar, and I think it's worth us talking about, and maybe there's a chance to see this recording. And so I think just starting the conversation with that, or if there are ever, if there's ever case reviews and talking about, patients, or bringing it up as part of the discussion that this, and normalizing it. I think we need to normalize it. And so bringing it up, not as a critique or as a concern that someone's not, if it's someone's on the waiting list, that they're not going to be able to handle the transplant. That's not what this is. It's a human reaction. So everyone here on the webinar, go back to their teams and talk to their teams about how great this was and how we need to talk about it more. I think that's the first step.
We definitely do need to talk about it more.
Lara, so I'm wondering, one of your slides I think was really interesting, talking about a new way of thinking about grieving. And one of the bullets was about meaning reconstruction, which is so interesting and I think helpful to think about with transplant recipients. And I think sometimes people forget or don't realize that transplant recipients are experiencing loss of their, previous life, their future lives, like they're going through that grieving process. And meaning reconstruction could be really beneficial for transplant recipients. And one way to potentially do that, especially those who are experiencing guilt, is really how are they living their best life post-transplant. So do you have any thoughts about that? And like, what are things that transplant recipients can do to give back and really like reconstruct their new life in a way that's meaningful and in honor of their donor family and donor?
Right. I mean, I shared that quote where I've had a couple of recipients say, I'm trying to live my life like my donor is watching. And that's like, as I said, is a beautiful idea and also incredibly humbling, and a little bit scary. So maybe not taking it quite that far, but just thinking about, I'm sure when people were sick, depending on how long they were sick and what their state was, of things that they wish that they were afraid that they would miss out on. Right. And so really being mindful of kind of everyday experiences that they're grateful to have, and then larger things, and really being mindful of that, and recognizing that they are extending the legacy of the donor, right? That the family wants this legacy, and they are an extension of that legacy, and how special that is that they get that opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think to follow that, like one of the things that we do with recipients when they're writing, if they are having trouble writing a letter, it is a great way for them to reflect on, like, what does this transplant mean to you now? Like, it doesn't have to be like, I'm going to go climb a mountain, but it could mean that I'll get to see my daughter get married, or now I can walk my dog like around the block, like things like that might seem little, but are really meaningful to someone. Yeah. I did want to say someone had commented that they think this has all been really great, even in the transplant field. Death and dying and the palliative process before transplant's not widely focused on, and it's very challenging. So thank you so much, Lara.
It is. I mean, we go into the business of transplant because we want to save lives, and it's not easy to admit that not every life is going to be saved, and that's hard to tolerate as a professional and as a human, but it's part of it. And we want to give our patients hope, so it's a balance of hope and reality. That's a challenge.
Yeah, and I think like it goes back to the quality versus quantity. Like, how can we focus on a quality life as opposed to 20 more years, 30 more years, but how can you make the best out of the time that you do have with this new gift?
Right. Yeah. And I think that the idea of time, extra time is a really powerful one. And there are situations certainly where recipients reject an organ or they pass away, and we have to share that information with the family, And traditionally, we share it if a family asks. We don't offer that information just randomly, but families will request updates. And if we get in that update that a recipient has passed away or needed to be transplanted again, those are difficult conversations with the family. It certainly can be another loss for that family. But while we don't want to minimize that loss or the grief that the family may be experiencing, we really try to frame it with, yes, this is disappointing, but please recognize that your gift gave this recipient extra time, 10 extra months, 3 extra years, or it was the bridge to the next transplant that is now successful. That this is really powerful, and if there's anyone who can appreciate the gift of extra time, it's a family who lost someone suddenly. And our donor families would do anything in the world to have 10 extra months with their loved one. And so we try to frame that even when things don't work out perfectly, there's still a gift there and there's still gratitude.
That's a wonderful way to wrap it up. I feel like we're just about at the 4 o'clock time, and I don't see any more questions. It was wonderful. Thank you so much, Lara.
Thank you so much. I appreciate everyone's participation. This is, as I said, it's a hard thing to talk about, but it's important.
Perfect. Well, I want to thank you ladies so much for the presentation and the discussion here today. And before we conclude today's program, I just really want to extend a sincere thanks to you, Lara, for your presentation. I think this is an incredibly important topic for all of us as professionals throughout the continuum to explore. And I personally appreciate a lot of the insights that you shared about processing grief and guilt. And as many of our participants shared, I think this is a topic that's not widely focused on, but absolutely should be. Because the reality is not only is death and dying something that our patients and our donor families are dealing with or struggling with, but it's also something that we as professionals have to deal with and process every single day. So I think it's important for all of us to consider some of those strategies that you shared to not only support our patients and our donor families, but to also promote that self-care within ourselves. So thank you so much for all that you shared today. Talia and Sarah, thank you for facilitating the discussion. And again, for all your efforts in coordinating this program and bringing Lara to the Alliance to share some of these strategies. And to our participants, I hope you found this program valuable to you as well. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Lara.